Hello and welcome to yet another tutorial by Davies Media Design. My name is Michael Davies, and in this tutorial I'll be going over the 4 different methods for creating custom brushes in GIMP. I'll also be covering the different types of brushes in GIMP just so you guys have a fuller understanding of the various brushes that are found in GIMP, how they work, and how that relates to the types of brushes you want to create. I'll be using GIMP 2.10.18 for this tutorial, which is the latest version of GIMP at the time of this tutorial. But of course, before I get into that, I want to direct you guys over to my website at daviesmediadesign.com. As always, I have tons of GIMP and Inkscape tutorials on here, as well as my GIMP book of layers and GIMP and Inkscape help articles, so definitely check that out. You can enroll in my GIMP 2.10 Masterclass from beginner to pro photo editing on Udemy. And I also have a brand new Fundamentals of Photo Editing in Darktable course, and I'll link the discount link in the description of the video for this course. You can also enroll in any of my Skillshare classes by visiting gimpschool.com, or you can get more with a premium membership to Davies Media Design. Your premium membership includes access to things like my GIMP Help Center app, ebooks like my GIMP book of layers, and exclusive content not found on YouTube. You can start your premium membership off with a 7-day free trial, and I'll include a link to this as well as all the relevant links from this tutorial in the description of the video. So let's start by briefly going over the 4 main types of brushes found in GIMP. The first type of brush is called the ordinary brush. Most of the brushes found in GIMP are going to be this brush type, and it uses what's called a pix map in order to paint your brush strokes. That pix map is displayed as a black and white pix map inside of your brushes dialog. If you have no clue what I'm talking about, let me show you. So I'll start by coming over here and opening up my brushes dialog. I can get there by going to Windows, Dockable Dialogs, and we'll go with Brushes. So here's your brush tab. A lot of you will have this tab open by default if you're using the default setup for GIMP. I've customized my user interface, so some things are rearranged, some things are closed down, but a lot of you will have the brushes dialog opened here already. So here you'll see what a pix map is. The pix map is this little black and white representation of the brush. So each one of these brushes here can have the black that you see replaced by whatever your foreground color is set to. So in this case, we're set to blue. And let me demonstrate this. I'll start by coming over here, going to File, New to create a new composition. Let's change this to 1920, hit the Tab key, 1080, and I'll click OK. So we have our composition open. I'll come over and grab my paintbrush tool. And by the way, another way to get to the brush editor, if you don't want to use the Windows menu, is you can come over here and click on the brush you have selected, and then down here at the bottom, you'll see a little icon. When you click on that, that will open up the brushes dialog. So right now, this is now set to a softer brush. We can go with this hard brush. So I am using a pen tablet for today's tutorial. You guys can just use your mouse if you don't have a pen tablet, but I have my pen tablet mapped out for GIMP, and I just put out a tutorial on that subject, so definitely check that out if you haven't already. I'll link it to this video. So I can increase the size of my brush using my tablet or the left and right brackets on your keyboard if you're using a mouse. So again, this is an ordinary brush, and when I paint with an ordinary brush, the portion that is black will be replaced by whatever your foreground color is. So most of the brushes in GIMP will have this quality. For example, I can choose a textured brush, and when I paint with this brush, that's going to paint that blue as well. And if I hit the delete key, that will delete all of the brush strokes I've done so far on my canvas. Ordinary brushes are saved as .gbr files, and anytime you create a new brush and you save it, you're going to want to save it into your brushes folder. We're going to do that here as we start to create our custom brushes later in the tutorial. But the second brush type found in GIMP is called the Parametric Brush. These brushes are going to be created using the built-in brush editor in GIMP. This is just a simple user interface the GIMP team has designed to make it easy to create simple brushes directly inside of GIMP. We'll get into using the brush editor here momentarily, but once you're done designing these parametric brushes, GIMP will automatically save them as a .vbr file type in your brushes folder. So this is one of the easier ways to create brushes in GIMP, not the easiest way, but definitely one of the easier ways. Parametric brushes are also ordinary brushes, and I know that's kind of confusing, but the reason for that, parametric brushes use that pix map system where it's going to create a black brush, and then the black from that brush is going to be replaced by whatever foreground color you have selected. So all parametric brushes are ordinary brushes, but not all ordinary brushes are parametric brushes. Hopefully you follow that logic. The third type of brush is called a color brush. This is most useful whenever you want to take a picture and turn it into a brush. The reason being that the color brush can take on any RGB color values. So it's not going to use any foreground value you have set. It's going to use whatever RGB values are originally found in the brush or in the image that you're using as a brush. So for example, if I come over here to this image, this is an RGB image, obviously. So if I come back to our composition, I've actually turned this RGB image into a color brush. So I'll show you how to do that later on, but here you can see it in action. So that's what a color brush looks like. You'll notice it's not taking on the color of our foreground. So I'll hit Control Z. There are some built-in color brushes in GIMP, including the infamous pepper brush. So this brush is a color brush. This will not take on the colors of your foreground color. It's just going to stay this green color. And this is upside down right now. But I'll hit Control Z. Color brushes can be created by saving images as .gbr files into your brushes folder. Of course, we'll get into that. But the last brush type is my favorite brush type, and that is the animated brush. So this type of brush allows you to create multiple brush heads for the same brush. And as you paint, the brush head is going to alternate between however many brush heads you create. So this creates a more dynamic brush head as opposed to a more static brush head, and it just opens up the possibilities a bit more, especially considering that GIMP allows you to create four-dimensional brushes. I'm not going to get too much into the multi-dimensional brushes for this tutorial, but it is possible. So I'll come over to my brushes dialog, and you can tell which ones are the animated brushes because they have this little red triangle in the bottom right corner. So if I click and hold this, you'll see it's going to animate through the various cycles, the various cells of the brush. That's a concept we'll get into. But you can see there are 3 different brush heads for that particular animated brush. And now if I paint with this animated brush, you can see it's going to be a bit more dynamic. Here I have the same version of the brush. It's not an animated brush. This is just a static brush with a single brush head. So if I paint with that, you can see the difference. So animated, ordinary. And I did point out the red triangle denoting the animated brushes inside the brushes dialog. There's a couple of other icons here, and I'll go over what those mean real quick. So the plus icon just means the brush is larger than the thumbnail that's displaying here. So anytime you have a plus sign and you click to preview it, clicking and holding, of course, you'll see that the preview is going to be larger. So there's a lot of plus signs here, especially since my icons are smaller right now. As I just pointed out, the red icon is going to mean an animated brush. And finally, the blue triangle icon in the bottom right corner denotes a parametric brush. So you can see there are several parametric brushes here that come with GIMP by default. All right, so those are the various brush types found in GIMP. Let's move on to actually creating our custom brushes. So just like there are 4 types of brushes in GIMP, coincidentally, there are 4 ways to create brushes in GIMP. So the first method for creating a custom brush is just by copying something to your clipboard. So to do that, you just use Control C, Command C if you're on a Mac, or go to Edit Copy in the main menu. And you can use this for anything, so we could use it right now on this image. If I hit Control C, that's going to copy this to my clipboard. And if you come over here, you'll see that this is now a brush here. So the first brush is going to be my clipboard image. You'll see this is going to max out at 1024 by 1024. That's the largest size these clipboard brushes can be. It'll also create a black and white version called the clipboard mask. So when I click and hold that, it looks the same right now because this is a black and white image. But if I did this for a color image, so I'll hit Control C, you'll see here we have a color version and here we have a black and white version. And as I mentioned, you can also go to Edit, Copy here. That's another way to copy this to your clipboard and create a brush from it. So now that I have this image copied, I'll come over here. Let's hit the delete key to get rid of those brush strokes. It's a pretty huge brush because it's a pretty big image. You can see this is set to 1024. Let's decrease it and go with our clipboard image. And right now I have my brush dynamics turned on. That's why this is sort of changing in size as I'm moving around. Let me decrease that size again. So now as I paint, this is going to paint the area that we copied to our clipboard. I hit Control Z, that's the first way to create a brush. And by the way, brushes created by copying them to your clipboard are just going to be temporary brushes. They're not going to be permanently saved to your brushes library. There's a bit of a process to do that, which I'll go over in a second. But the second type of brush you can create in GIMP is a brush you create from an image. So let me come back over here to my photo of the dice. And what I want to do with this image is I want to crop it and scale it down first. That way it's a bit more manageable as a brush. So I'll grab my crop tool and I'm going to come over here to the fixed aspect ratio. Let's change this to 2:1. And now when I click and drag my crop tool, that's going to crop this with a 2:1 aspect ratio. And I'll click in the center to crop it. Now let's scale it down. So I'll go to Image, Scale Image, and I'm going to scale this all the way down to 400 by 200. And I'll click Scale. So again, we can hit Control-C to copy this and add it as a new brush. And because this is now smaller than the 1024 max size for a brush, you'll see the entire image is now going to be copied here to our clipboard as a brush. And let me just grab my paintbrush tool again, come over to our composition, and here you can see it's painting the entire image. So I'll hit the delete key, come back, and let me cycle over to my zoom feature, zoom in a bit, and cycle back to my brush. If I wanted to permanently save this as a brush, not just have it copied to my clipboard, I have to export this to my brushes folder. So first we have to figure out where is our brushes folder. We can do that by going to Edit, Preferences, and click on Folders to expand it, and then scroll down. So the first folder here is the brushes folder. I'll click on the first one. So this is the location we want to use, this first one. This is where our user brushes need to be stored. And what I like to do is come over here and click on this icon and just navigate inside the brushes folder there. And once I've done that, I'll click OK. That's just going to store that as a recent place so I can easily access it later. You can also just remember this series of folders that you need to go to. But now just come over here and click OK. So now we know where our brushes folder is in GIMP. Next, let's save this image that we have here as a brush. And to do that, we're just going to save it as a .gbr file. So I'll come over here and go to File, Export As. And we'll name this Dice. And we'll change this to .gbr. Maybe we'll go Dice Image. So now if I come to Recently Used, you should see a folder here that says GIMP 2.10, so we'll click on that, and now you'll see we're taken to the first few steps in that folder there to get to the brushes folder. Now we'll just go inside the brushes folder. Here you can see some of the brushes I've already created. So now we're going to save this Dice image as a GBR brush file and hit Export. So with GBR files, the options it gives you is to add a description. This description is going to be what shows up at the top of the brushes dialog here once you click on that brush. So once you click on a brush to select it, and let me bring up this little dialog again. So the description shows up here at the top. The spacing is going to be the space between each instance of the brush stroke, each instance of the brush head. So in this case, I'll go with the default, which is 10, and hit Export. So it's not going to show up here quite yet. This Dice brush is the same brush we just created, but I created it earlier. I can always remove brushes just by clicking that X and then hit Delete. But now I need to refresh my brushes here so we can have that new brush we just created show up. So I'll click that refresh button there. And now you'll see our Dice image. And if I click and hold the thumbnail, you can see a preview there of the full-size brush. So I'll come over here, and now when I paint with this brush, it's going to paint that Dice image. So now if I were to close down GIMP and reopen it in another session, or if I were to copy something else, so for example, if I copied this mess we just created here, that changes these brushes here, but this brush is here to stay. So the third method for creating a custom brush is through GIMP's built-in brush editor. And I can get to the brush editor by clicking on one of these brushes. Let's just go with this first parametric brush here. And now if I come over here, you'll see there's an option I can edit this existing brush, or what I'm going to do is I can click here to create a new brush. So when I click on that, that's going to bring us to the brush editor. So as I mentioned towards the beginning of this tutorial, all the brushes created inside of this brush editor are called parametric brushes. So for starters, you can change the name of your brush up top here. I'm going to name this Custom Para 1. So that's our first custom parametric brush. So this is just a preview of what your brush looks like. And the first option here is we could change the shape. So by default, it's going to be a circle. The second option is the radius. That allows us to change the size. So you can see by increasing the radius, we're increasing the size. It does top out there, so you can't really just infinitely increase this. So there we have a circle brush. It's fairly large in size. We can also change this to a square brush there or a diamond shaped brush. So if you do have a square or diamond shaped brush, you can use the spikes option, and that's just going to change the shape of the diamond or the square. So if I come back to the square, you'll see now it's a bit more like a star shape. If I come back to the circle brush, that doesn't apply here. Although if I bring it back down to the minimum value, you'll see it does sort of increase the size of the brush here. So it has some effect on here, but it doesn't create spikes like it does for the square or the diamond shape. But the next option is hardness. So right now this is a soft brush, a fairly soft brush because the edges are fuzzy. I can increase the hardness though, and that'll make this have harder edges, so more defined edges as you can see there. If I decrease the softness, the edges won't be quite as defined, they'll be much softer. So that just creates more areas of partial transparency, giving that brush a fuzzier look. So let's go with, maybe we'll go with around 50% hardness. The next option is going to be the aspect ratio. So at 1.0, this will be a perfect circle. But if I change the aspect ratio, you'll see that'll narrow this down. It'll sort of squish it. And that applies to the square and the diamond shape. The angle just allows you to sort of rotate this. So if I click and drag the angle slider, you'll see that'll rotate that. Finally, the spacing is just the space in between each instance of the brush. So I can actually test this out in real time here. This is what our parametric brush looks like right now. And if I increase the spacing, that'll just make each instance further apart as I paint. Whereas if I decrease the spacing, of course, each instance will be closer together. So let's just go with a bit more spacing on here. Once you're done with this, you don't need to do anything. All you have to do is close out the brush editor. So I'll click Close Tab. And now we have a brand new parametric brush here. And if I click and hold this, you'll see there's the new brush. I'll hit the delete key to get rid of that. Parametric brushes use a .vbr file type, and these file types are going to be automatically created by the brush editor in GIMP. So you don't have to do anything to, save this or export this to your brushes folder. GIMP is going to do it automatically. That's what makes making parametric brushes a bit easier. And you may have noticed here, as I was painting, it took on the color of the foreground tool here. So if I change the color, let's go with something like red, it will take on that color. Also, as I paint faster, you'll see it's making this smaller if I go faster, larger if I go slower. That's because this is using the brush dynamics I have set up for this. So parametric brushes will use your brush dynamics, and it'll also take on all of the tool options that you can play around with here inside of your brush's tool options. So I'll hit the delete key, and that'll get rid of that. So the final way to create custom brushes in GIMP is going to be to paint your own brushes. This method to me is the best method for creating custom brushes because it gives you more creative freedom. It gives you more flexibility when it comes to designing brushes. So let me show you how you can do this. You could start by going to File, New, and here you're going to create a composition based on the size you want your brush to be. Remember, the max size is 1024 by 1024. A good size to me is 180 by 180. And I'll click on the advanced options. You actually want to fill this with transparency. You don't want it to have a background color, so I'll click transparency and click OK. Now we can paint whatever we want here as our custom brush. I'm going to start by coming over here and grabbing a nice hard brush, and I'll use the little size wheel on my pen tablet here to decrease the size of my brush. And let me just reset. So I want my color to be black. That way this can act as an ordinary brush, and anywhere that I paint black will show up the foreground color when I'm actually using this tool. So remember, I have my basic dynamics turned on here, and what I did the first time I created this brush was I just created a bunch of random dots, and then I made the dots a bit more dense as I got closer to the center here, and then I can even just straight up paint black here, so that's full opacity, like that. All right, so I've finished designing this brush. The next thing I want to do is export this to a .gbr file. GBR stands for GIMP brush. This is just going to ensure that this is an ordinary brush, which is that first brush type. But one last thing I need to do before I can export this is I need to convert the color mode of this image to grayscale. So go to Image, Mode. Right now it's set to RGB. Switch that over to grayscale. This ensures that when we're using our brush as an ordinary brush, it will convert the black colors we're using here to the foreground color that we want to use. Once I've changed the color mode of this to grayscale, now I'll go to File, Export As. And so here we are still in our brushes file, and I am going to keep this name, I typed this earlier. So this is Pointed Dots and Take Two because I already did a Pointed Dots version of this when I was testing out the tutorial. So name this whatever you want, just make sure it ends in .gbr to save this as a GIMP brush, and I'll hit export. So this little dialog will pop up. This description is what's going to show up top here whenever we click on our brush. I'm okay with leaving that the same. And then the spacing I'll leave by default. That's just the space in between each instance of the brush stroke. So I'll hit export there. Once we've done that, I'll come over here to our composition, our blank composition. Let me reset my colors here to black and white. So over here in the brush dialog, you won't see the brush we created just yet. So I'll have to click this little refresh button. And now right here, you'll see here is the Pointed Dots Take Two. So you'll see there's a plus sign there. That means this is larger than the thumbnail. So if I click and hold, there's the full size version of our paintbrush. And under here, here's our tool options. Make sure you do have your paintbrush selected here. And you'll see that this is taking on our basic dynamics. So as I move my brush around, you'll see if I press harder, it'll paint harder. If I go lighter, it'll paint lighter. So I'll hit the delete key to delete that. So I'm just painting with black right now, but I can come over here and I can change this to whatever color I want. So let's go with red. So I'll hit the delete key. So that's how you create a brush by painting it manually. So you're designing it manually. But we just did a simple GIMP brush. What I want to do is create an animated brush from this. So I can do that by coming back over here. And right now we only have the single layer. What I'll do is hold the Shift key and just click on the new layer icon. That'll create a new transparent layer again. Shift and click on this one more time. So now we have 3 different layers, and I'm going to click and drag these layers below the original layer. And you can double click on this to rename it. So we can go with brush 1. We'll name this brush 2. And this will be brush 3. So brush 1 is completed. Let me hide brush 1, come over to brush 2, and we'll come back to our hard brush here that we used before. And I can zoom in, and let me also cycle between my menus here on my tablet. I'm going to use the touch ring on my tablet to decrease the size of this. You can also use the left or right brackets on your keyboard. And I'll come over here, reset this back to black and white. So now I'm going to just do the same thing. I'm just going to paint little dots here. And because we're painting random dots, it's going to be different than the first time we did this. So even though it's going to be similar, it will look slightly different. As we get towards the middle, we're going to increase the amount. And then once we get in the center, I'm actually not going to paint it quite as much this time, so it's a little different. So there's the second brush. So first brush, second brush, and now let's do the third brush, just using that same technique. And this one we will paint a bit more solid in the middle. Just like that. So shift click, here's all 3 together. So now we can save this as an animated brush, and that's going to ensure that as we paint, it's going to cycle between these 3 different brush heads we created. So to do that, all I need to do is go to File, Export As like we did before, but now instead of saving it as GBR, we're going to save it as GIH. GIH stands for GIMP Image Hose. That is just another term for an animated brush. They also use the term GIMP Image Pipe. I'm not really sure why all the technical names here. So GIH, and now we'll hit export. And here you'll see the menu option for your animated brush or your brush pipe. Again, a bunch of different technical names for this. But once again at the top you have the description. That shows up top here when you have your brush selected. Spacing, this time it's displaying as a %. So this % is based on the diameter of your brush. So the spacing is going to be 20% of the total diameter between each brush head here. The cell size is just the size of each instance of your brush. So in this case we have 3 different cells, and each cell is going to be the entire size of this layer. So that's going to give us 3 cells total. And I'm going to do an example after we're done with this example where we actually split the image up into multiple cells instead of doing a single cell per image or a single cell per layer, which is what we're doing right now. And you can also create multiple dimensions, as I believe I alluded to earlier. I'm just going to stick with a single dimension just because it is a bit more complicated to get into multi-dimensional brushes. But down here under ranks, this just basically determines the order in which cells are painted, as well as how dimensions factor into which cells are painted. So in this case, it's only 1 dimension, so we only have 1 row here for the ranks. You can have up to 4 dimensions for your painting in GIMP. But if I click on this drop down here, this gives you a variety of what's called selection modes. So these are the ways in which your cells over here are painted. So incremental just means it's going to paint the first brush here first and then the third brush last. Angular is going to be useful whenever you have multi-dimensional brushes. In this case, it's not going to be useful. So this is basically based on an x-axis, a y-axis, as well as a z-axis. So this comes in handy when you have 2 or more dimensions. Random just means it's going to randomly paint all your brush heads here. There's no particular order. Velocity means it's going to paint certain brush heads based on how fast or slow you are moving your paintbrush. Pressure, same thing, except it's going to be based on how hard or soft you are painting with your pen tablet. And then X and Y tilt has to do with whether or not your pen is tilted in a certain direction. So I'm not going to get into those really. I'm just going to stick with incremental, which is basically the default option, or it should be anyway. So that's just going to start with the first brush and go down to the third brush and just cycle that way every time. 3 ranks just means there's 3 different things it's got to cycle through. So now I'll come down and click export. So now we have an animated brush, and let's come back over to our little testing environment. It hasn't shown up here yet technically. My older brushes I made did show up, but let's refresh. So this is going to be the new brush we just created. So this is the animated brush. And you can see this one has the little red icon in the corner. So if I click and hold that, you'll see it animate there. And now when I paint with this brush, it's going to cycle between those 3 brushes, and that gives us a more dynamic brush as we're painting. It's just a bit more of an exciting brush as opposed to that first one we created, which only has a single brush. So hit the delete key, and let's do a direct comparison. There's the first one, and here's the animated one. So much better brush there. And of course I can change the color. So let's go with that red color or a red color. So we can also change the color. I'll hit the delete key. So I'm also going to show you guys how I designed this crosshatch brush. But first let me just demonstrate something there with the cells. So here is that image we were working with earlier. And when we created that animated brush just now, each layer was its own cell. We had 3 layers, we had 3 cells. Those 3 cells are animated as part of the entire brush animation. In this case though, we only have a single image, but what happens if we want to break this image up into multiple parts and therefore have multiple cells that exist within this one image? What we can do is we'll export this like it's a brush like we were doing before. So File, Export As. And I'll go over to Recently Used and choose Brushes again. So here, let's change this to Dice Image, and we'll go Animated. Once again, this is GIH, so GIMP Image Hose. And now I'm going to hit the Export button. So same options here as the last animated brush we did. But now, instead of having the cell size being the entire size of the image, if I decrease the cell size here, so I'll go 100 by 100, and let me move this stuff out of the way because you guys probably saw some guides were created here. So the guides are showing us where the cells are on our image. And so each cell size is 100 by 100. This is a 400 by 200 image. So 100 by 100 fits in this fashion where now we have 4 columns and 2 rows. So now when I come over here under number of cells, it now says 8. And display as is showing 2 rows of 4 columns on each layer. So we only have 1 layer, but this layer is going to have 2 rows, 4 columns, as is divided by the guides here. And because this is a single dimension brush, again, I'm not going to get into multi-dimensions. There's only 1 rank, and it's showing us that there are 8 cells total. So we could change how those cells behave based on the way we paint or based on the selection mode here. And once again, I'm just going to go with incremental, which means it's going to cycle through 1 through 8. And when it comes to having multiple rows and columns, the order is typically the top left cell first, and then it'll go to the right, and then it'll go down to the bottom left and go to the right. So that's the typical order when you go with incremental. Of course, you can also go with any of the other options we discussed earlier. I'm just going to keep this set the way it is and hit export. Of course, I created this earlier, and so let me just delete the earlier version I did of that. But now let's come back to our testing ground. Hit the refresh button. There is our animated brush. And now you'll see as I draw with this brush, it's cycling between those 8 different cells we created. So there's 8 different brush heads as we move with this brush. So I'll hit the delete key. All right, now I'm going to create that cross-hatched brush just to give you guys another example of an animated brush. So let's come over here, File, New. And I'm just going to go 180 by 180 and click OK. So this composition, I accidentally gave a white background. Let me just create a new layer, and we'll fill this with transparency. It's named brush, that's fine. I'll click OK. And let's delete the background layer. You don't want a background. And we'll also go to image mode and just make sure this is set to grayscale. So now what I'll do is I'll come over here, and I do want to note that you can use any of the paint tools when it comes to designing your brushes. You can even use the My Paintbrush tool, which has a variety of texture brushes. So I'm going to go with the pencil tool and come over here and go with this little pixel here. So this is going to paint this as a single pixel, but I also have the basic dynamics on, so it'll be a bit more dynamic than the usual pencil tool would be. But now what I did here for this is I just created, let me hit Control Z, make sure my foreground color is set to black. So I just created some lines like that. So there is a nice cross-hatched brush, but this is only one single brush head. I actually want to do multiple since I want to do an animated. So hold Shift and let's click on this twice. That's going to create new layers based on the settings I had before. So that's just a quick way to create new layers. So let's hide that brush and let's just do another one. And this time, let me increase the size a bit here. So once again, we'll do a random cross-hatching here, hide that one, and for the last one, let's go in between, do the same thing. All right, so there's our brush. If I come back over here, Shift-click, that'll unhide the other 2 brushes, so this is the 3 combined. Now I'll go to File, Export As, making sure we're in the Brushes folder. I'll do Crosshatch, Take 2. Make sure it's ending in GIH. Hit Export. So in this case, once again, I'll leave the spacing at the default. The cell size, I will leave the full size because I want each cell to be the size of a single layer. That gives us 3 cells total, one-dimensional. And for the ranks, we're going to set this, we could do incremental or random. I don't really care either way. I'll just go with random for the sake of demonstration and click Export. Now let's come back here to our testing ground, hit the refresh button. Here is our new crosshatch brush. So crosshatch take 2. And now when I paint with this, you'll see that gives us a really cool texture brush and it's pressure sensitive. And it's responding to those dynamics, so as I paint faster, it paints it thinner. And I'll come over here, let's change this to a blue color, hit the delete key, and so now our brush is blue. One last thing I want to note before I let you guys go is that usually these custom brushes that you create by designing them yourself, painting them yourself, will not respond well to all of the tool options. So for example, brushes like this, they will respond to size, aspect ratio, and angle, and spacing as well actually. But when it comes to hardness, if you make this a softer brush, this isn't really going to turn out right. You can see there, it just looks sort of like a blob. So it's not really going to work well with that softness setting. And I'll hit the delete key here. Let's reset the hardness back to 100. And the force, it's not even going to let us do. So you'll see that not all tool options are available for these custom brushes. But in my opinion, this is still my favorite way to create a brush and the best way to create a brush inside of GIMP. All right, so that's it for this tutorial. Hopefully you liked it. If you did, you could check out my YouTube channel at youtube.com/daviesmediadesign. Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell icon to be notified each time I have a brand new tutorial. You can also check out all the links to my resources in the description of the video. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.